In the last few videos, we have created a very simple Spring Boot project and enabled Spring Security on it. We also built a REST API with a path welcome, and we tested through browser and Postman to understand how it works on a high level. But if you ask me how Spring Security Framework works internally once it receives any request from the front end or any third party API consumers, this is the flow how it works exactly. So this video will help you in detail how Spring Security Flow works internally. As you can see, there are sequence of steps that has been noted right from 1 to 10. The very first step that will happen is as soon as someone calls our API through browser or any API consumer way with their credentials, a filter, a authentication filter, which is present in the Spring framework, Spring Security Framework, will be intercepting the request. Once it intercepts the request, it will try to convert whatever authentication details that we are receiving from the user, like username and password, into an authentication object. This authentication object is the base where all the validation of user credentials will be validated in the further steps. Once that authentication object is built, the request will be passed to the authentication manager. Authentication manager is the place where it will identify what is the correspondent provider, authentication provider that my request has to go. Like we may have lot many process where we can validate our user credentials, like you may use database to validate user credentials, or you may use LDAP, or you may use OAuth. So there can be many possible providers that your system may have. Authentication manager is a place where it will identify what is the most appropriate authentication provider that my request has to be sent. Once authentication provider receives the request, this is the place where all your business logic will be implemented. When I say business logic, the logic related to your security, like how do I validate username and password. There can be scenarios where you may receive email as a user. There can be some scenarios where you will receive a mobile number as an username and passwords. So based upon all such scenarios, you will implement all your logic of security validation inside your authentication provider. And authentication provider in turns will use two other interfaces. One is user detail services and other one is password encoder. So user detail services is the interface which holds user schema, like how my user details should look like. Like there might be a scenario where my user will have username, password, OTP, multi-factor authentication. All that schema I will identify under my user and user detail services, and password encoder is the interface which will tell how my passwords has to be encrypted, encoded and decrypted while validating them. Security provides many password encoders which we will be seeing in the coming sections, like bcrypt password encoder, no password encoder in the scenarios where we don't want our password to be encoded or encrypted. All possible password encoders are available in Spring Security, which we'll be seeing in the coming sections. Once authentication provider using user detail services and password encoder validated whether input credentials are valid or not, the flow will be given back to authentication manager followed by the authentication filter. Now my authentication object which I initially sent from my filter will hold whether the user is a valid authenticated user, what are the authorities, what are the roles associated to it inside my authentication object. Once my authentication filter receives my authentication object, which is populated from authentication provider and manager, which is seen in the step 8, this authentication filter will pass that authentication object to security context where my details will be stored inside the container. If you remember in the previous session, there is a token that gets generated. So in this scenario, authentication will hold that token which will be stored inside my Spring container using security context interface. Security context is the place where we saves the data of the user once he or she authenticates themselves. Can be he might be a valid user or she might not be a valid user. All such details will be stored inside the security context and given back to the browser. From second time onwards, if they are trying to pass the same security information, all this flow will not be get executed because we already try to validate that person using that credentials entered, and Spring Security will tell you, okay, using this token, whatever I'm receiving from second time onwards, whether this is a valid token or an invalid token. This is how works internally in Spring Security Framework. If there is a scenario where I can remember only one slide in this entire course, this is one of the slide that I will choose to remember because this is the base for entire Spring Security, and we will discuss each component by component how to configure according to our custom requirements in the coming sessions. Hope this is making sense to you. Thank you and see you in the next video. Bye.